Greetings. Welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. My name is Christopher Rice, and you're watching our special series on sustainable development and cybersecurity. Our guest today is Megan Stifel. Ms. Stifel is an attorney and the founder of Silicon Harbor Consultants, a firm that provides strategic cybersecurity operations and policy counsel. She currently serves as Cybersecurity Policy Director at the Public Knowledge Organization. In addition, she is a senior policy advisor to the Technology for Global Security organization and is a non-resident senior fellow in the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft initiative. Megan has previously served in cybersecurity and policy roles at the National Security Council, Department of Justice, and U.S. House of Representatives. She received her Juris Doctorate from the Maurer School of Law here at Indiana University. Today, Ms. Stifel will share her insights on current cybersecurity issues, the policies surrounding them, and how countries can sustainably achieve robust cybersecurity. Megan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Well, to start out, could you tell us more about your firm, Silicon Harbor Consultants, and the types of services you provide? Why would a business in today's age need these kinds of services?
Sure. So Silicon Harbor Consultants is a play off of Silicon Valley, and I moved a couple of years ago from Washington, D.C. to Charleston, South Carolina, which is trying to brand itself as Silicon Harbor. So the idea is just basically to say we're consultants who can either consult to Silicon Harbor and the Charleston area, or consultants who, in my case, in most of my clients' work, just live in Charleston and take advantage of the great space and innovative town that it is. But the general, sort of, to answer your question, I think, sadly, we're in a phase where there are very few reasons why companies, large or small, don't need to think about cybersecurity issues. And so if they're not in a position to be able to hire KPMG or another big consulting firm, they can call me and I can try and help them, or I can try and point them to one of my network of networks who has the expertise that might be useful to them.
Well, why do these companies need these services now, though?
Sure. So we're essentially in a place where there are very few companies and there are very few things that are not connected. The rise of the Internet of Things is turning companies that used to manufacture Oral-B toothbrushes that had nothing to do with the Internet, and now you can apparently buy a toothbrush that will instruct you how many times you brushed your teeth. And basically, everything is interconnected. So where we had companies that just built refrigerators, they're now having to think about what it means to have that refrigerator connected to the Internet and the security and privacy implications that connection brings with it.
Great. Well, the EU has taken private information very seriously. They've introduced laws such as the General Data Protection Regulation that became enforceable this year. Can you describe what this means for U.S. businesses that operate in the EU?
It means they have a lot of work ahead of them, but presumably most of these entities that are operating internationally have already been preparing for the implementation of GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, in May of this year. The regulation has a series of requirements, and among them including recognizing the rights of the individual in connection with information that is obtained or given by that individual. So U.S. companies that are operating overseas, and particularly in Europe, will be subject to the GDPR in most cases. There are some limitations on the number of potential consumers and customers that they reach, and that being the threshold for the regulation applying. But generally speaking, I would argue that even if you're a small company that might not presently be subject to the regulation or soon be subject to the regulation, it's worth ensuring that your business practices will probably comply, because among other things, if you are a small company, you're likely supplying a larger company in many cases. They may themselves, by virtue of their need to comply with the regulation, pass those requirements on to you. But I think it's, among other things, it's also a wake-up call for U.S. companies that have, and the way we've approached these issues, to say data about individuals is not necessarily theirs, to a newer requirement to give users a greater control over their data. And the data protection regulation requires that entities that it regulates be able to respond to inquiries about consumer and user data and be able to delete that data upon the request of the user.
Okay.
So we're in a new age.
Yes, we are. Well, so laws such as these and other privacy regulations, what effects do these have on cybersecurity? And do you think the U.S. needs similar policies toward private information?
So there are, I would say, a couple of effects. The thrust of the law is, of course, to be beneficial and to enhance cybersecurity. The challenge is that in doing so, it may actually potentially reduce cybersecurity. If we're requiring companies to have systems in place that allow them to maintain knowledge of the types of information that they have, those systems can themselves present a vulnerability if they're not carefully developed in a way that ensures the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information that they maintain. Whether or not the U.S. needs a similar regulation, I don't think so at this point.
No.
We'll probably be subject, most of our companies will, by virtue of their the globalization of this space, be subject to the GDPR. So we may not see direct benefits from it immediately, but in the longer term, I suspect we'll see some of these requirements on Facebook, for example. We may see some of these, the benefits in terms of user control over data. So hopefully that gets to part of your question.
Yeah, so kind of like a standardization just because of globalization, right? Okay.
Which is, some companies, the U.S. has, generally speaking, resisted regulation in this space around cybersecurity and direct regulation over privacy. We right now have a sectoral approach to privacy regulation. So in the financial services sector, there's federal law that requires that companies undertake security practices and take privacy seriously. You've probably received lots of privacy notices around from your bank. Similarly, in the health sector, healthcare issues, HIPAA and other requirements on the healthcare providers have allowed that sector to be slightly more secure than other parts of the economy. You can look at the Equifax breach to see that consumer reporting agencies kind of have fallen through the cracks. So we may see some regulation around security and privacy, but whether it's as extensive as the GDPR is, I think we won't quite be there yet. And depending on how reaction to and response to sort of sectoral approaches continues to evolve, I think that will, if it's meaningful and effective, I don't think we'll see ourselves in the same GDPR world, at least directly. Okay. Probably indirectly.
That makes sense. Oh, Megan, you've been participating in our symposium on sustainability and cybersecurity all day. One thing that's been in the headlines lately is the repeal of net neutrality in the U.S. As someone who's worked in government and the private practice, how does this repeal affect the sustainability of cybersecurity here in the U.S.?
It's a good question. I think while there was certainly the hope and the expectation that the net neutrality requirements that were the Federal Communications Commission put in place a couple of years ago would further enhance cybersecurity, there's recent reminders that we're having from various industry groups pointing out the fact that there were some recommendations that evolved around cybersecurity for entities subject to the FCC's jurisdiction that took place before the Title II approach was followed by or enacted by the FCC. So while it's certainly for reasons not necessarily directly related to cybersecurity and privacy, I would argue not in our interests to repeal the net neutrality order. I think in the sense of cybersecurity, there isn't a direct negative impact because we will fall back on the multi-stakeholder recommendations that were developed under the old so-called regime. So I think we're not in a negative position yet.
Megan, thanks so much for coming in to speak with us today, and thank you for your participation in the symposium as well. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thanks for having me.
That's all the time we have for this edition of Cyber Focus. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please let us know at CIBER, that's C-I-B-E-R, cyber, at indiana.edu.